Hi, so my country is South Korea. Starting off in Unit 1, we're looking at the basic geography. So I divided all the information into site and situation with definitions so you get the geographic information and examples at the same time. Now we go into Unit 2, population and migration, starting with dependency ratio. And what you really need to know about dependency ratio is the definition and what the impacts are on a country if the ratio is high or low. And all of that is listed on the screen. Onto population density, I have a list of the largest cities with population, along with the map and population density map of South Korea. I put them all together so you can really see the population density map with numbers and city names, so you can see how the population distributes around the most populated areas. I'm saying how the colors get lighter around the red areas, red being the most populated areas. Push and pull factors. Push factors are reasons that make people want to leave a place, and pull factors are reasons that make people want to go to a place. The factors can also be explanations as to why some places are more populated than others. And I divided the factors into urban and rural since factors differ from location. Now we're going into CBR and CDR. CBR stands for crude birth rate, and in South Korea, the crude birth rate is very low, as we see on the graphs here too. And CDR stands for crude death rate, and on the graphs we can see that the crude death rate is very low too. Now population pyramids. If we look at the population pyramid of South Korea, we see a very small bottom showing a very low amount of birth rate, which we also saw in the previous slide with the graphs. And when we look at the larger middle part of the pyramid, that shows that there's a low amount of death rates. And we also saw that information on the graph on the slide before. The demographic transition model on the right shows that when the yellow line of birth rate and the green line of death rate are both low, it falls into the category of stage 4. So, because the birth rates and death rates are low in South Korea, then that shows that South Korea is on the stage 4 of the demographic transition model. Now onto Unit 3, culture. First, we're looking at the traditional values, one of the most important parts of Korean culture since it affects the everyday life of somebody who lives in South Korea. So these values are influenced by Confucianism, Shamanism, and Buddhism. And it's mainly the beliefs that are affecting the traditional culture. And even though these are all religions, they don't really play a huge role in religion in South Korea, because if we look at the graph, we cannot see Confucianism or Shamanism. And we do see Buddhism, but it's a very small percentage of 15.5%. Moving on to language and ethnicity, we can look at the graph and see that the population is not very ethnically diverse because 97.7% of the population is Korean, and it's the same for language since Korean is the official language of South Korea and 48 million people who live in South Korea speak Korean. Now, looking at the cultural landscape, the picture below of the palace is an example of cultural landscape because you can identify the cultural attributes, which is the South Korean architecture, and use it to identify the place. Moving on to Unit 4, politics. The first question is, what is the morphology of the country? Basically, what is the shape of the country and if it has any effect on the country in the whole? And the basic answer is no, it doesn't. And so that section right here basically explains how Korea split. And to sum it up, China and Japan were in a war over who could take over Korea, and Korea decided to side with the U.S. with the peace treaty. But in this peace treaty, it said that China had rule over Korea. But then Japan won the war with China and colonized Korea and had rule over it for 35 years. But after World War II, Japan lost and Korea was split into two for those who won the war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This history can also explain why the North and South both have different types of government, since the Soviet Union, who controlled the North Korea, wanted a dictatorship, and the U.S., who controlled South Korea, wanted a presidential system. North and South Korea still have the same types of government that were installed by the U.S. and the Soviets. And this is just a continued on the history and government. Now on to Unit 5, development. We already established that South Korea was on stage 4 of the demographic transition model, making it an MDC, a more developed country. And MDCs usually have a high GDP, high HDI, and a high GNP, and South Korea is no different, and you can see the numbers and rankings on the screen. But looking more at the HDI value, it's very high, and you can see that the life expectancy is 83 and the mean years of schooling is 12.2, which is really good and shows that the standard of living is very high. Now, these graphs on exports and imports are mainly on economics, but you can also analyze business relations between countries. For example, on import and export for Japan, the numbers are almost the same, so you can say that there's mutual business between South Korea and North Korea. Moving on to agriculture. So on this slide, we have agricultural land uses and why the agricultural sector is commercial. But looking more on the question, is the agricultural sector more commercial or subsistence? It says basically that industrialization caused people in rural areas to move to urban areas, and this caused the people remaining in the agricultural sector to start commercial agriculture. Before the 1960s, agriculture made up 45% of South Korea's GDP. But during the 1960s, industrialization occurred. And if we look at the bottom of the slide, it says that agriculture today only makes up 1.69% of South Korea's GDP. So yeah, industrialization had a huge effect on the agricultural sector, dropping the percentage from 45% in the 1960s to 1.69% in 2021. Now on to our last unit of urbanization. So we start with the rate of urbanization, which is very high with no growth and decrease, and it's been like that for the past 20 years. Moving on to urban population. Looking at the graph, we see that between the urban and rural populations, there's a large difference. So why is the urban ratio so high? Well, an increase in urbanization happened after Korean War, where there was widespread food shortages and unemployment, that a high number of rural people moved to Seoul, which was the primate city at the time, and still is today, because after the rapid urbanization occurred, Seoul's population went from 2 million and increased to more than 10 million today. This slide is more urban population with cities and population numbers. So on this slide, we're answering the question, which city model does most of the cities in South Korea resemble? My answer is the multiple nuclei model. And I think this because there are many similarities between the multiple nuclei model and the layout of the city of Seoul, the example I'm using. So first, looking at the left picture, we see a CBD, Central Business District, and 2 outlying business districts. And looking at the multiple nuclei model, there's also an outlying business district. That's the first similarity. Now looking at our top right picture of the location of high-class residential area, we can see it's located far from the CBD and is close to an outlying district. And this is the exact same as our model because the green area that is far away from the CBD represents a high-class residential, and the gray city next to it represents an outlying business district, which is the exact same as our layout of Seoul. Now if we look at the last picture, titled The Center of Manufacturing, we can see it's on the outskirts of the city. Now looking back to our model, the red part that's on the outskirts of the city is also a manufacturing, which is the third similarity, exactly the same. So those are my 3 pieces of evidence as to why cities in South Korea use the multiple nuclei model. Moving on to urban challenges, many of the issues that occur are because of overpopulation. So here's the bibliography of my sources, and thank you for watching.